a preliminary question on ideas. So Forge tries to go back and forth to combine ideas and practices. We do action research, applied research, but also reflexive activism and advocacy. And I wanted to go back to your idea of meta-crisis. And crisis, etymologically, also means a fork on the road, right? It's literally in Greek, a fork on the road. So, and if one reads the work of Thomas Kuhn and then social scientists who have looked at what sociologists call critical junctures, right? 1948 was a critical juncture. 1973 was a critical juncture, right? Where the old crisis, the rise of the environmental movement. So when things are shifting radically and everything seems unstable, sounds and feels unstable. And this is certainly one of those moments. I think that we all agree, despite our differences in terms of cognitive, of intellectual and advocacy frameworks, that this is an unprecedented moment of everything happening and changing at the same time. So we're at a moment of crisis in that more generative way. Crisis also tends to mean the end of something or the terminal illness of something. And I wanted to ask you about the role of ideas in this moment. There's a fantastic book about 1973 and how, for example, the Chicago School of Neoliberal Economics, read the room very effectively, provided the ideas that needed to be kind of served to policymakers, trained a whole cohort of economists who fan out around the world and became the Chicago Boys. And then you have that's directly related to Pinochet, directly related to what happened in the UK, in the US in the early 1980s. So what would be your view about the importance of ideas in this particular moment?
Gosh, thank you. There's a few things come to mind. So firstly, it's related to crisis is an idea, first of all, right? And what's interesting about crisis as an idea is that it's used to mobilize power. And there are critiques of the idea of crisis for that reason. To declare a crisis is often to say normal rules are off. We have to now do something different, right? And if you look at, modernity is a big capacious notion, but if you look at the last sort of 400 or 500 years, many argue that it's precisely the crisis mentality that has driven the modern story. There's a crisis is what leads to war, crisis is what leads to investment, crisis is what leads to revolution, and so on. Where we are now, I feel, is something like the exhaustion of the idea of crisis. I feel like there are so many things going wrong that the notion of crisis as turning point has become a little moot. Crisis is meant to come and go quickly, to call for resolve and judgment. And through that judgment, the crisis passes, right? And you get back to normal times. And again, in Kuhnian terms, normal paradigm resumes. But where we are now, some have called it omni-crisis, macro-crisis, perma-crisis, poly-crisis. And I've spent far too much time thinking about all of this. But I do believe that meta-crisis is a useful term precisely because it gives us a way out of crisis. When you look within the idea of crisis and try and get beyond it, which are also meanings of meta, there is a kind of liberation. So now I try and think less about crisis and more about potential, which is why the emphasis on solutions here appeals to me. Because I think what's exciting for me is the prefigurative world, people who are already doing things differently and trying to actually create a different kind of world that's not driven by a crisis mentality. Because arguably, after a while, from a long shot, you begin to see that's part of the problem. That the very framing of how we should deal with the world is through crisis management is what arguably keeps the systems and structures going as they are.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jonathon. The only thing that I would say, although this is kind of weird because I asked the question, but the only thing that I would add to that is that the literature on critical junctures shows that it is at the moment of crisis where the public and policymakers and general human beings are in search for answers.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're in the business of generating ideas, this is a good time to be doing hard work on new epistemological frameworks, on new solutions. Because this is a moment of disorientation, of uncertainty. If we were back in the early 1990s, in the Fukuyama years, well, many have thought that the final idea had come by, and then that neoliberal economics plus liberal democracy plus a narrow understanding of human rights had won the day. So there was not as high a demand for new ideas and as much openness to new ideas. So on the kind of the silver lining that I see, and I would like to hear your thoughts about this, is that this may be a good moment for generative ideas.
Yeah, it definitely is. However, I would add to that in the sense that ideas from what mental framework, right? The one of the sort of corollaries of the meta-crisis analysis is that if there is an underlying delusion that's perpetuating the world in the way it is, what would it mean to escape from that? How can we think outside of it in some sense? And there I think you've got certain mental structures of consciousness to do with sort of preferring what's actual to what's latent, for example, to overvaluing logic and reason, undervaluing creative insight, metaphor, and so on that you mentioned earlier. So I think it's not just about new ideas, it is about rethinking the sort of very basis of thought as well, and also the means of legitimation and justification. Just pouring new ideas is not quite enough. You have to actually get to some more deeper bedrock of values, principles, through which you can sort of build a different kind of world.
Thanks for that. That makes me think of, you quoted Richard Rorty, and Richard Rorty wrote once that it's not about arguing better, but speaking differently. Right. So that kind of framing the whole conversation a different way in different terms. So we have fantastic questions. There's no way that I can do justice to all of them. So I'll start with the ones that I got here first. So one question asks, Alvin Toffler in Future Shock, the 1980s, posited that not only is change constant, but that the pace of change is always increasing. So to each of us, what do we think about this? And also, are we prepared to respond to the condition of overwhelm that comes from rapidly quickening change?
Well, thank you, César. Although it's your paper I want to quote from, because your Human Rights 2030 paper makes a very good point that we need to attend to time as a fundamental principle of how we think about our moment and how we think strategically. We have to be much more responsive because the pace of change is quickening. There's an even deeper point, though, which is that time is asymmetric, profoundly asymmetric, and you can despair all too easily if you look at the past time, which is kind of concretized and become fixed, and you imagine that the future time is just like that. But future time is actually brimming with potential. It hasn't happened yet. You know, it sounds like a trivial thing to say. There is some kind of hysteresis, there's some kind of baked-in process through which the past becomes the future, but there's a lot of freedom in there. And I think you have to make your commitment to freedom. You have to believe that actually there is scope for radical renewal that we can't necessarily even see yet, that is latent. And therefore, I trust in that. So my view of time is to see it as a fundamental thing to orient towards our experience of time, but also to realize that it's fundamentally asymmetric. The nature of the time in the future is absolutely open and full of potential. The nature of time in the past is concretized and fixed. And somehow that helps to reorient yourself towards hope and possibility.
Along similar lines, well, since the mid-1940s, coinciding almost perfectly with the contemporary human rights movement after the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, we've been going through what earth scientists call the Great Acceleration. Right? This is where population growth skyrocketed. This is when the use of pesticides, the use of carbon, the use of so many pollutants, and also just the explosion of human beings on the planet created qualitatively different experiences for everyone, and not just humans, but very importantly, non-humans. And we're just coming to terms with the Great Acceleration, and we're now seeing, and this is part of what I hope to present on Saturday, an acceleration of the Great Acceleration, right? From my point of view, like the reality of the onset of the climate emergency and generative AI are fundamentally kind of qualitative leaps in the terms of the acceleration of all the changes that we've discussed here. So the question that was asked, what to do with the overwhelm? This is where I fully agree with you, Jonathon, that a different disposition needs to be developed in the field, because the instinctive and traditional way of engaging with problems in the world in the human rights field, for good reason, has been to constantly put out fires, accelerate at the same pace or even faster than the acceleration of facts. So jumping from facts to conclusions, and also jumping from one issue area to another, has been something that all of us have done in the human rights field. And slowing down, taking pauses, and finding ways to professionally do that, I think are key challenges. Louis Bickford is here in the room, and he established a fantastic organization called Membria, which is all about listening, like deep listening. Right. We're very good, especially in law schools, at training students in lawyering and speaking. But we never train people to listen. Listening is slow. These are slow skill. Yeah. And there, psychologists have developed a whole branch of research about slow emotions. Empathy takes time to develop, right? So thinking about time differently also entails clear kind of direct changes in human rights practice, but also in human rights education, I think.
Yeah. I love that point about listening. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but when I had a moment at a conference a few years ago, where it was kind of revelation. For the first time in my life, I felt I was actually listening to people. It's a weird thing to say, I confess, but I was early 40s already, but I suddenly noticed, my God, people are really interesting, you know? And you think that's, you know, I knew that already, and I had friends, and I wasn't particularly socially dysfunctional, but I suddenly got fascinated just because I was listening somehow at a deeper frequency. And I think it is a kind of transformative practice. I also think it helps to get beyond a kind of fetishization of crisis. I think we have I think someone calls it the pungent flavors of polemic. You know, that we get high on this feeling of moral indignation and how terrible everything is. And I think you have to go through that, because otherwise you have denial and displacement. But I do think it's important to get to the other side of it, to not be caught up in the kind of tragedy of despair. Because if you look at it dispassionately, you see the Earth as a kind of superorganism of 8-odd billion people, and you look at, you know, demand and supply cycles and the underlying way things are being financed and the amount of goods being traded. When you see it objectively from a third-person standpoint, it's very hard to see how you could turn that ship around. It's really just beyond comprehension. But I think when you stop and listen to potential, to listen to other ways of being and knowing, it's less a source for despair. Because you sort of think it hasn't happened yet. There is a certain amount of lock-in, but there's a certain amount of freedom too, and you have to sort of leverage that freedom for as much as you can.
Yeah. So we have fantastic questions here. I'm going to have to choose the second one that came to me, but also that speaks to other questions about inequality, right? So the question here to you is about the who, right? Who are we talking about? Because we all talk about the we, but who is the we? So quickly it said, like, you speak of 8 billion people in your final set of questions, but isn't the problem largely created by quote-unquote elites, the quotes are in the text, who don't see their lot as being shared with the rest of us? And if so, should we treat them differently, ask more of them?
Yeah, great. So it's the question. The we question is the heart of the matter. The curious thing about the world, English is the preeminent language for diplomacy, for business. It's kind of the biggest lingua franca. It's the most widely spoken language in the world, even more so than Chinese and so on when you look at the stats. English has only one sort of pronoun for the plural, which is we, and we is inherently ambiguous, like horribly ambiguous, because you don't have another term to refer to when you want to invoke some sense of collective agency. But of course, collective agency is about power, and you need the we to be much more specific. So there's a deep problem in the very structure of the main language of the world that fails to disclose the kind of agency we need to speak of our problems intelligibly. So that's one part of the problem. The second thing is, yes, absolutely, humanity as a reference point is actually not that useful, because humanity as such has no agency. It's just a descriptive term for all the people in the world. Which is one of the reasons why I think it's Jason Moore speaks about the capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene. Because really the problem is not humanity as such. It's this mechanistic machine of profit extraction from nature. What do you do about that? Well, there's also this side of it that is not quite so dismissive, that says, look, are we really condemned to be the idiots who blame the bastards for the world falling apart? Like really, like on the one hand, yeah, we don't have the power of Sam Altman or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, or even for that matter, Joe Biden or Xi, or any of the wonderful authoritarian leaders you put in that memorable slide. Yeah, we don't have that kind of power, but I don't think it's enough to just say, and therefore we can't do anything. Building power is precisely the challenge. You're building power here, César. Like, this is why you gather, to build alliances and develop your ideas and your practices. You have to take responsibility for building kinds of power that are commensurate with the challenges we face. Whether that's ideationally, culturally, or more profoundly in terms of hard power, you have to work on it. So I accept the premise of the question is very well taken, but I also think we should forgive ourselves a little bit, because English as such doesn't actually give us much choice, but to be unfortunately ambiguous in most of our references to collective agency.
Thank you so much, Jonathon, and please join me in thanking Jonathon for this fantastic teacher.
Thank you.